Paul McCartney isn't just a music icon. He helped shape the very sound of modern pop and rock. From Beatlemania to a storied solo career, his influence is undeniable. But even one of the friendliest faces in music has strong opinions. Let's take a closer look at 5 musicians Paul McCartney famously clashed with or criticized over the years. 1. Madonna. First on the list of stars who may have annoyed Paul McCartney is none other than Madonna, the queen of pop. You might think that since Madonna and Paul come from such different music styles, they wouldn't compete at all. After all, Paul is known for writing classic rock and pop songs full of melody, while Madonna is famous for her bold pop dance music and constant changes in style. But in the 2015 book Conversations with McCartney, Paul admitted that at one point, Madonna's huge success really got under his skin. According to Paul, he didn't like how the media treated Madonna like she was some kind of goddess. He felt the public gave her too much praise just because of how she looked on TV. He said, "While you're looking at her from your lowly room on your little telly, you think she's a goddess." Then he added, "You give her all of that. She doesn't even ask for it." With that line, it seems Paul thought people were giving Madonna more credit than she actually earned. He kept going, explaining how it seemed people thought Madonna was special just because of her fame. Once she's on tour, she's selling out 30,000. She's a goddess. Look at the clothes she wears. No wonder. It's because she's better than us. We are only mortal. We've got tellies, and I bet she never sits and watches telly. These comments suggest that Paul viewed Madonna's rise with a competitive edge. The biggest clue came when he said, "When you get out on tour, you're a fellow gim." It wasn't just admiration. Paul saw her as someone on his level. To his credit, Paul didn't hide his feelings. In interviews from the early 1990s, he openly admitted to feeling jealous of stars like Madonna and Michael Jackson, saying they were the competition now. This was a rare moment of honesty that revealed just how seriously he took his place in the pop world. The last tour in the 90s, it was Madonna I was worried about, he said. "If you're in any way competitive, it's what you do. You look at the charts, see what they've sold. Well, let's try and sell some more. It's just life." This shows that even after the Beatles ended, Paul was still trying hard to stay on top in the music world. As for Madonna, she didn't seem too bothered. She has always been known to ignore criticism and keep moving forward. Also, she wasn't even a big Beatles fan when she was younger. She preferred Motown music. So if she ever heard about Paul's comments, she probably just shrugged them off like she usually does. Next comes a band that loved the Beatles, but may have pushed Paul's patience way too far. 2. Oasis. If the Beatles were the band that built the foundation for modern rock music, then Oasis were the rowdy, confident group that followed in their footsteps, sometimes too closely. Led by the famously loud and bold Gallagher brothers, Noel and Liam, Oasis came from Manchester and quickly became one of the most talked about bands in the world during the 1990s. Their songs were full of catchy melodies and strong vocals, and it was very clear that they were huge fans of the Beatles. Liam Gallagher even sang in a way that reminded many people of John Lennon. With all of that admiration, you might think Paul McCartney would have felt proud or honored, but that's not exactly what happened. In fact, Paul McCartney didn't always have nice things to say about Oasis. The main reason? He thought they were just too full of themselves. Their confidence was sometimes seen as cocky, and it rubbed people the wrong way, including Paul. The biggest problem started in '96. By that time, Oasis had already released 2 massive albums, Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, Morning Glory. These records made them international superstars. But then Noel Gallagher made a bold and shocking claim during an MTV interview. He said that Oasis was better than the Beatles. Later on, Noel admitted that he wasn't thinking clearly when he made that statement. He said he may have been joking or just caught up in the moment, but the damage was already done. A lot of people thought his comment was disrespectful, especially Paul McCartney. By 1997, Paul finally responded, and he didn't hold back his opinion. He said that Oasis was derivative, which means they copied too much from other bands instead of creating something new. He also said they thought too highly of themselves. Then he delivered a blunt line about the band. "They mean nothing to me." It was a clear sign of how little regard he had for them. Those words would have been hard for any band to hear, but especially a band that clearly loved and looked up to the Beatles. Oasis had built their sound around everything the Beatles had done before them. and to hear that they meant nothing to Paul must have felt like a huge rejection. Years later, in 2001, Paul explained more about how he felt in an interview with Howard Stern. He said that when Oasis first came onto the scene, he actually liked them. He thought they had promise and could become a great band. But Noel's comment about being bigger than the Beatles changed everything. It made Paul feel like they had lost their way. Even while trying to be polite, Paul still offered a subtle critique, saying, "I've just said they are slightly derivative. It sounds soft, but it's still a smart and sneaky way of saying their music wasn't very original." As time passed, Paul's feelings seemed to cool down a bit. In 2016, he spoke with GQ magazine and gave a more balanced view of Oasis. He said, "Oasis were young, fresh, and writing good tunes. That's a pretty big compliment coming from a Beatle." But Paul couldn't help adding one more warning about what he thought was their biggest mistake. "I thought the biggest mistake they made was when they said, 'We're going to be bigger than the Beatles.' I thought, so many people have said that, and it's the kiss of death." In other words, Paul had seen what happened to bands that bragged too much. He believed that once a band made a bold claim like that, people expected too much from them, and it usually didn't end well. He had been around long enough to know how quickly fame can fade and how big egos can lead to big problems. And just when you think old friendships are safe, Paul fires off a bold take about a group nearly as famous as his own. 3. The Rolling Stones. Don't be fooled by Paul McCartney's friendly, grandpa-like image in interviews and on stage. Deep down, Paul is still extremely competitive, just like his old Beatles bandmate, John Lennon. This side of him was already clear from how he once talked about Madonna. But Paul's need to compete doesn't stop with pop stars. It also shows up when he talks about some of his oldest rock and roll friends, the Rolling Stones. For many years, fans around the world have argued over which band was better, the Beatles or the Stones. And once in a while, Paul throws in his own opinion, which always gets people talking. It's something that music writers love, even if it sometimes annoys Mick Jagger. One of the biggest moments in this ongoing rivalry happened in 2021. Paul did an interview where he made a pretty sharp comment about the Rolling Stones. He didn't exactly insult them, but what he said hit hard. "I'm not sure I should say it," Paul began carefully, "but the Rolling Stones are a blues cover band. That's sort of what the Stones are." Then he added something even stronger. "I think our net was cast a bit wider than theirs." That wasn't just a passing thought. Paul was clearly saying the Beatles had more musical variety and were more creative. In his eyes, they reached farther, tried more styles, and pushed more boundaries than the Stones ever did. To be fair, this wasn't the first time Paul had said something like this. In 2020, he told Howard Stern something similar. First, he softened the comment by saying, "The Stones are a fantastic group," which made it sound like he was being kind. Then he followed it with, "They are rooted in the blues. When they are writing stuff, it has to do with the blues, whereas we had a little more influences." Paul ended with a statement that made his feelings clear. "There's a lot of differences, and I love the Stones, but the Beatles were better." That's typical of Paul's approach. He often balances praise with a candid opinion. Mick Jagger didn't seem too upset on the outside. In fact, in 2023, he invited Paul to play bass on a song called "Bite My Head Off" for the Rolling Stones album, Hackney Diamonds. That move showed there's still respect between them. In an interview with Zane Lowe, Jagger even said that there wasn't really any competition between the two bands in his mind. But he also pointed out something that matters. The Rolling Stones kept touring and playing to huge stadiums for decades, while the Beatles stopped touring back in 1966 and focused on studio recordings instead. Jagger was essentially making the point, we succeeded in a different way. While both artists have spoken respectfully about each other in public, it's clear their successes were often viewed in contrast. Then comes a story that isn't about charts or music styles, but a moment that left one legend feeling hurt and looked down on. 4. Phil Collins. The story of Paul McCartney and Phil Collins isn't really about music competition. Instead, it's about one personal moment that stuck with Collins for years. Phil Collins, who became famous with the band Genesis and later as a solo artist, has always had a deep connection to the Beatles. When he was a teenager, he even appeared in the background of their movie, A Hard Day's Night. Later, he helped out on George Harrison's solo album, All Things Must Pass, by playing some percussion. So it's safe to say that Collins looked up to the Beatles and expected some level of respect from them too. But one day in 2002, during the Queen's Golden Jubilee celebration at Buckingham Palace, Collins had an experience with McCartney that felt completely different from what he hoped for. By that time, Phil Collins was already a major star. He had won many awards and had tons of hit songs. So when he met Paul at the event, he felt confident enough to ask for something special. Collins brought along a rare copy of a Beatles biography and asked McCartney to sign it. It was the kind of thing any fan, especially a fellow musician, might ask. But what happened next really hurt. Paul turned to his then-wife Heather Mills and said, "Oh, Heather, our little Phil's a bit of a Beatles fan." For Collins, those words felt like a slap in the face. In 2016, Phil talked about this moment in an interview with the Sunday Times. You could still hear the anger in his words, even after all those years. "And I thought, you fuck, never forgot it," he said. Collins interpreted Paul's remark as condescending, saying it left a lasting impression. Collins felt like Paul was treating him as just another fan, not as an equal in the music world. He later explained that Paul has a certain way of talking to people that makes them feel small. Collins said, "He has this thing when he's talking to you, where he makes you feel, I know this must be hard for you because I'm a Beatle. I'm Paul McCartney, and it must be very hard for you to actually be holding a conversation with me." This painted a very different picture of Paul McCartney, one that doesn't match the charming, humble person many people believe him to be. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, Paul still sees himself as sitting high above other musicians, even those who are stars in their own right. When Paul heard about what Collins had said, he reached out. But instead of saying sorry, Paul apparently suggested that they just forget about it and move on. Phil mentioned in another interview with Billboard that Paul didn't apologize. He simply wanted to leave the past behind. Collins said he didn't mean to hurt Paul's feelings by going public with the story, but he also felt it was important to speak the truth. Otherwise, it wouldn't improve, Collins said, standing by his decision to talk about it. So what really happened here? Was this just a misunderstanding? Maybe Paul didn't realize how his words sounded. Or was this a peek behind the curtain, revealing the complex layers behind Paul McCartney's public persona, far beyond the familiar charm and fame? Either way, it left Phil Collins feeling small, embarrassed, and upset, even years after it happened. And now we reach a fallout so big, it ended a friendship. And it all started with a lesson in business that backfired badly. 5. Michael Jackson. One of the most painful and public fallouts in Paul McCartney's long career didn't come from a feud over music styles or fighting for the top spot on the charts. Instead, it came from something much deeper. What Paul saw as a real betrayal from someone he had once called a friend. That person was none other than the king of pop, Michael Jackson. Their friendship, which had once looked warm and full of creative energy, fell apart over something many fans wouldn't expect. Money, business, and the ownership of songs that had changed the world. In the beginning, things between them were going great. Michael Jackson, already a global superstar, had covered a song written by Paul called Girlfriend. Paul originally wrote the song with Michael in mind, and it ended up on Michael's hit 1979 album, Off the Wall. This connection opened the door for future projects. Soon after, the two teamed up on a duet called The Girl Is Mine, which became the first single released from Michael's legendary album Thriller in 1982. The song was light and sweet, and even though it wasn't their best work, it was a huge success thanks to the fame of both singers. Their friendship continued into the next year, when they recorded 2 more songs together, Say, 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 and The Man, which appeared on Paul McCartney's 1983 solo album, Pipes of Peace. The song Say, Say, Say became a massive worldwide hit and was played everywhere. It showed how powerful their partnership was and how much the public loved seeing these two stars working side by side. But during the time they were recording those songs, something happened behind the scenes that would change their friendship forever. According to stories told by people close to them, during a conversation about money in the music business, Paul gave Michael what seemed like friendly advice. Paul told him that buying music publishing rights, meaning the rights to own the songs that other people write, was a smart way to earn long-term money. Paul had been doing this for years and was simply trying to pass along a helpful tip. What Paul didn't know was that Michael would take this advice seriously and use it in a way Paul never imagined. In August 1985, just 2 years after they recorded Say, 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 Michael Jackson made a big business move that shocked the music world. He bought the rights to most of the Beatles' song catalog by purchasing a company called ATV Music for $47 million. These were the rights to many of the songs that Paul McCartney and John Lennon had written together, the songs that had made the Beatles legendary. To make things worse, Paul had been trying to get those song rights back for years. He hadn't received all of the money he was supposed to get from the Beatles songs since 1969 because of problems with the original company that published their music, Northern Songs. Paul had even been planning to make his own offer to buy the rights back. But Michael got there first, outbidding everyone, including Paul. When the news came out, Paul was completely shocked and hurt. He had trusted Michael. In interviews afterward, Paul didn't hide how upset he was. He said, "I think it's dodgy to do something like that," clearly showing how betrayed he felt. Then he added a quote that fans remember to this day: "To be someone's friend and then buy the rug they're standing on." That sentence said it all. Paul described the situation as a betrayal, saying Michael had bought the rug they were standing on. This wasn't just about money. For Paul McCartney, those Beatles songs were part of his soul. He had spent years writing and performing them, and now someone else, his own friend, owned them. Michael Jackson didn't say much about it at the time, but in his 1980 autobiography, Moonwalk, he tried to explain his side. He wrote that both he and Paul had learned the hard way how important it was to control your music and understand publishing and royalties. That may have been true, but for Paul, it didn't take away the pain. Their friendship never fully recovered after that. They stopped working together, and while Paul never publicly declared a total break from Michael, it was clear that things had changed between them. Paul wanted those Beatles songs not just for the money, but because they were his life's work. And losing them to a friend hurt more than losing them to a stranger ever could. So was Paul just being honest, or does fame bring out the critic in every legend? Smash that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe for more music stories like this.